That night, Ethan Carter believed he was simply cleaning an office like any other night, pushing his cart down a hallway he had walked 1,000 times before, without anyone ever looking up to notice him. He had no idea that the woman standing silently behind the glass door was Victoria Sinclair, the most powerful chief executive in the entire corporation, a woman whose decisions moved markets, and whose name appeared on the cover of business magazines from coast to coast. When she overheard the janitor whispering into his phone, promising his daughter that he would find enough money to save her, something inside Victoria's chest tightened in a way she could not explain and had never once felt during even the tensest boardroom negotiation of her career. She stood frozen behind the glass, watching a stranger's shoulders shake with a grief too heavy for words, and something in her carefully guarded world quietly began to shift beneath her feet. 3 days later, that same little girl was wheeled into an operating room with every expense already paid in full, though no one had told her father exactly who was responsible for the miracle. But once the surgery ended, the billionaire asked the father for only one thing in return: a single, unexpected request that would slowly rewrite both of their lives and the lives of everyone around them, forever. Ethan Carter was 35 years old, and from the outside, his life looked like an endless list of things he had lost along the way, one after another, with barely enough time to grieve any of them properly. His wife, Sarah, had died in a car accident when their daughter Lily was only 3 years old, leaving him to raise her completely alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city, far from family who might have helped. He learned to braid hair from online videos late at night, to cook meals that a 5-year-old would actually eat without complaint, and to hold back tears until long after she had fallen asleep in her small bed each night. During the day, he was simply her father, walking her to school with her backpack slung over his shoulder, packing her lunch with little notes tucked inside the napkin, sitting beside her bed whenever nightmares came in the dark hours before dawn. At night, he became someone else entirely, a janitor pushing a cart through the marble hallways of Sinclair Group, mopping floors that reflected chandeliers he would never be able to afford in 10 lifetimes of honest work. He told himself it was temporary, that one day things would be easier, that hard work always found its reward eventually, if a man was patient and stubborn enough to outlast his circumstances. Then, Lily was diagnosed with a congenital heart defect, and the word temporary stopped meaning anything at all to him, dissolving into a fear that followed him through every waking hour. The doctors explained, gently but firmly, that surgery would be required within a matter of months, and that waiting any longer would put her life at serious and irreversible risk that no parent could accept. The estimated cost ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an amount so far beyond Ethan's reach that it felt like a number pulled from another universe entirely, one that had nothing to do with his own. He sold nearly everything he owned that could be sold: his late wife's jewelry, his old truck, even his own wedding ring, keeping only what Lily needed to feel safe and unafraid. He took on a second job during his lunch breaks, then a third job on weekends, stitching together hours until his body barely remembered what rest even felt like anymore. His hands cracked and his eyes constantly tired. In front of Lily, he smiled every single time she looked at him, telling her that everything was going to be fine, that Daddy had a plan and always would, no matter what the doctors said. Behind closed doors, in stairwells and parking garages, and the front seat of his car late at night, he wept in silence so that she would never once hear the fear in his voice. The phone call came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the hospital's voice calm and clinical as it delivered words that quietly shattered whatever fragile hope he had left standing. If the procedure could not be scheduled soon, the doctor said, they could no longer guarantee the outcome everyone had been hoping for, and time had officially become the enemy. Ethan hung up the phone that evening and sat alone in his kitchen for a long while, staring at a stack of unpaid bills he had arranged neatly by due date, as though order alone might somehow soften the impossible math in front of him. He thought about calling his late wife's sister, a woman he had not spoken to in nearly 2 years out of pride more than anything else, but he set the phone down before he could dial the number. He thought about a payday loan office he had walked past on his way home from the hospital, its neon sign promising fast cash, and felt a familiar wave of shame rise in his chest before he pushed the thought away entirely. Somewhere down the hall, Lily was asleep with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, unaware that her father was quietly measuring the distance between what he had and what she needed to live. Victoria Sinclair was also 35. Though her life bore almost no resemblance to Ethan's in any visible way at all. Separated by a distance, measured in far more than dollars, she had become the youngest chief executive in the history of Sinclair Group, a woman whose name appeared in business magazines beside words like brilliant, ruthless, and untouchable. Though few of those articles ever mentioned the word lonely, she had grown up believing that money solved almost every problem worth solving, a philosophy inherited from a childhood spent watching wealth open doors that would otherwise have stayed shut forever to people like her family. Victoria was disciplined to the point of exhaustion, rarely sleeping more than 5 hours a night, rarely allowing herself anything resembling a personal life outside the walls of her office and her spreadsheets. Colleagues respected her, investors trusted her completely, but almost no one working beneath her claimed to actually know who she was underneath the tailored suits and the confident posture. On a night when she had stayed unusually late, finishing a quarterly report that refused to balance the way she wanted it to, frustrated and rubbing her tired eyes, she happened to glance through the glass wall separating her office from the hallway outside. She noticed a man mopping the floor with quiet, careful movements, the kind of attention most people never bothered giving to work no one else would ever notice or thank him for. She might have looked away and forgotten him entirely within seconds, except that a moment later he slipped into the corridor and answered a video call in a hushed, urgent whisper meant only for one small person on the other end. On the small screen was a little girl in hospital pajamas, telling her father to remember to eat dinner, her voice thin but remarkably steady for a child carrying so much sickness inside her small body. Ethan laughed softly, promised her he would, and asked about her day as though nothing in the entire world weighed on his shoulders at all, hiding the exhaustion in his own voice. The moment the call ended, he sat down right there on the floor of the empty hallway and pressed his palms against his face, his shoulders shaking with grief that had clearly been held back for far too long by a man determined to stay strong. Victoria stood frozen behind the glass, unable to move, unable to look away, watching a stranger fall completely apart in what he believed was total privacy. Far from any judging eyes, she had watched powerful men weep over lost deals and vanished fortunes in that very building, but she had never once witnessed a man cry like that over nothing but love for someone smaller and more fragile than himself. Something shifted in her that night. Quietly, without any grand realization or dramatic moment. The way a single crack can appear in stone, long before anyone notices the whole structure has changed. Before she left the building that evening, still thinking about what she had seen, she picked up her phone and sent a short message to her head of human resources, asking for the complete personnel file of the janitor working the night shift on her floor. The file arrived on Victoria's desk the following morning, thin and unremarkable at first glance, yet somehow impossible for her to put down once she began reading through the details line by line. She read that Ethan Carter had never once been late in 3 years of employment, had never called out sick a single day, had never missed a shift regardless of weather, exhaustion, or personal hardship of any kind. He had never applied for any company assistance program, never requested an advance on his salary, never asked human resources for help of any kind, even when the note suggested he clearly needed it desperately. Every dollar he earned, according to a note quietly attached by a sympathetic supervisor who had clearly noticed his struggle, seemed to disappear directly, with accolade into medical bills piling up for his daughter's ongoing condition. Curious in a way, she rarely allowed herself to be about anyone who worked for her. Victoria quietly asked a trusted associate to look further into his circumstances, careful to keep her interest completely discreet from the rest of the building. What she discovered surprised her even more than the file itself, because Ethan had turned down several offers of financial assistance from charitable organizations and even from coworkers who had noticed his struggle and tried to step in. When someone once asked him why he refused help he so obviously needed, his answer was simple and unshakable: that he wanted his daughter to grow up proud of her father, not pitying him for accepting charity. That single sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in Victoria's chest, and absolutely refused to leave her thoughts for the remainder of that entire day. following her from meeting to meeting. It reminded her, unexpectedly and painfully, of her own father, a man who had built nothing close to Sinclair Group's empire, but who had taught her nearly everything she still believed about the world before he passed away. He used to tell her, back when she was young enough to still ask innocent questions about fairness and justice, that the most valuable person in any room is rarely the wealthiest one standing inside it. Victoria had spent so many years chasing growth charts and shareholder confidence that she had nearly forgotten the exact sound of her father's voice, saying those words to her at the kitchen table. That night she lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling of an apartment that cost more than most people would earn across an entire decade of honest labor, unable to stop thinking about a man crying alone in a hallway. By the time morning light finally crossed her window, she had already made a decision, and she reached for a pen before her own doubts could talk her out of what her heart had already settled on. Somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, she had also decided that whatever she did next would need to protect Ethan's pride as carefully as it protected his daughter's health, because she understood, even then, that a man like him would refuse charity long before he would refuse to save his own child through his own two hands. The following morning, before her coffee had even gone cold on her desk, she signed a document that would set an extraordinary chain of events into motion. One she instructed her legal team to keep entirely confidential from every single department in the building. Her assistant asked, cautiously, whether the amount listed was correct, since it exceeded anything Victoria had ever approved for a single anonymous case before. Victoria simply nodded and told her to proceed, adding only that the donor's identity was never, under any circumstances, to reach the family or the hospital administration. She had learned long ago that certain decisions did not require lengthy justification, only conviction, and this was one of the rare moments in her career where conviction had arrived before logic could argue against it. By the time she left her office that afternoon, the wheels were already turning, though the man they would soon change had no idea anything had shifted at all. It struck her, walking to her car through the empty parking garage that evening, that this was the first decision in years she had made purely because it felt right, rather than because a spreadsheet somewhere had told her it was wise. 2 days later, the hospital called Ethan again, though this time the tone on the other end of the line sounded completely different from the anxious calls he had grown used to receiving. A woman explained that an anonymous fund had stepped forward to cover the full cost of Lily's treatment, from the surgery itself to every medication, every specialist consultation, and every session of physical therapy that would follow afterward for months. Ethan asked, again and again, who could possibly be responsible for such generosity, but the woman on the phone said only that the donor wished to remain unnamed for the time being. He sat on the edge of his bed holding the phone long after the call had ended, unable to process the fact that the impossible mountain in front of him had simply vanished overnight while he slept, exhausted and unaware. When the day of the surgery finally arrived, he held Lily's small hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room, promising her that everything would be fine, praying with every fiber of himself that it was true this time around. Unknown to him, a woman in an expensive coat stood quietly outside the observation window of that same operating room, watching through the glass with an intensity that surprised even her own security detail waiting nearby. Victoria told no one at the hospital who she truly was, offering only a generic explanation about representing the fund that had covered the family's costs, careful to remain anonymous a little longer. For 12 long hours, she waited in that sterile hallway, refusing offers of coffee, refusing to sit down, refusing to leave even when her assistant called repeatedly about urgent matters demanding attention back at the office. When the surgeon finally emerged, pulling off his mask, and said that everything had gone exactly as they had hoped it would, Ethan collapsed against the wall and wept the kind of tears that come only after unbearable, unimaginable relief finally arrives. A few hours later, Lily opened her eyes in the recovery room, groggy but smiling faintly, reaching for her father's hand as if she had never doubted for a single second that he would be there waiting beside her. A nurse quietly told Ethan that the surgeon considered the repair one of the cleanest outcomes he had seen all year, and that with proper follow-up care, Lily's heart would likely function normally for the rest of a long and ordinary life. Ethan pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead and whispered a promise he intended to keep for as long as he lived, that he would spend every remaining day making sure she knew exactly how loved she truly was. It was in that quiet, golden moment, with Ethan pressing his forehead gently against his daughter's small hand and whispering how proud he was of her, that Victoria finally stepped forward and introduced herself for the very first time in person. Ethan's first instinct was to drop to his knees right there in the hospital corridor, overwhelmed with a gratitude far too large for any words he could possibly find to express it. Victoria reached out and gently stopped him, telling him there was no need for that at all, that she simply wanted to see the man behind the file she had read so carefully the night before. Still trembling, still barely able to steady his own voice, Ethan told her he would do absolutely anything to repay what she had done for his daughter, that no favor would ever feel too large in return for a life saved. Victoria studied him for a long, quiet moment, something like amusement and something like tenderness crossing her usually unreadable expression as she chose her next words with care. She told him there was, in fact, one thing she wanted from him, and that it had nothing whatsoever to do with money changing hands between the two of them ever again. Starting tomorrow, she said, he would no longer push a cart through the hallways of Sinclair Group after the sun went down each night. No matter how much he had come to depend on that routine, Ethan blinked, certain he had somehow misunderstood her, waiting patiently for her to explain what exactly she meant by such a strange and unexpected request. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile many of her own employees had witnessed from her in years, and told him he would instead become her special assistant, starting immediately, effective that very week. The announcement, once it reached the executive floor, landed like a small earthquake through the polished hallways of the company's glass and steel headquarters. Senior leadership gathered behind closed doors almost immediately, questioning aloud how a man who had spent years mopping floors could possibly be qualified to work beside the chief executive herself on matters of real consequence. Some argued it was reckless and irresponsible. Others quietly called it nothing more than a clever publicity stunt designed for headlines, and a few genuinely worried it signaled instability in a woman they had always considered flawless. Victoria listened to every single objection without ever once raising her voice, letting each argument run its course before she finally spoke. She believed in people, she told them plainly, and that belief was not something she intended to apologize for to anyone seated in that room, regardless of their title. On his first morning walking through the doors of the executive floor, Ethan wore a borrowed suit that did not quite fit him properly at the shoulders. Carrying a folder of notes he had stayed up all night, preparing, terrified and hopeful in almost equal measure. At home the night before, Lily had insisted on picking out his tie, choosing a simple navy one because she said it matched the color of his eyes, and told him he looked exactly like the fathers she saw picking up other kids from school. He had laughed at that, kissed the top of her head, and promised her he would try his very best not to embarrass either of them on his first day in a world he barely understood. Standing in the elevator that morning, watching the floor numbers climb higher than he had ever traveled inside that building before, he reminded himself of the same thing he told Lily before every hospital visit, that fear was allowed as long as it did not get the final word. The unfamiliar world of the executive floor overwhelmed Ethan almost immediately. A maze of unspoken rules and quiet judgments that no one had ever bothered teaching him how to navigate. He did not know the correct way to greet a board member walking past him in the hallway, did not understand half the financial terminology thrown around so casually in every meeting he sat through, and had never once in his life read a balance sheet before that week. What he did know, deeply and instinctively, from years of quiet observation, was how to listen without interrupting anyone, how to keep a promise once he had made it out loud, and how to notice the small details most people train themselves to ignore completely in pursuit of bigger things. Within his first few weeks in the role, he began to see things that years of formal education apparently had not taught anyone else on that floor to see with such plain clarity. He noticed that employees on the lower floors grew visibly nervous whenever leadership walked past their desks, as though honesty had quietly become a liability rather than a virtue worth protecting inside those walls. He noticed that certain reports reaching Victoria's desk had been polished and reshaped until they barely resembled the messy, complicated truth actually happening down on the ground floor of daily operations. He noticed, too, that several genuinely talented employees had been overlooked for years simply because they lacked the social confidence required to promote themselves loudly in crowded meetings. Slowly, almost without either of them fully realizing what was happening between them, Victoria began treating Ethan as a kind of second set of eyes, someone who could walk through the building and tell her what was truly occurring, rather than what people wanted her to hear repeated back. This new arrangement did not sit well with everyone in the company, and several senior managers began to view Ethan as an unwelcome outsider threatening the comfortable order they had spent years carefully constructing for themselves. Quiet conversations started happening behind closed doors. Strategies whispered over coffee about how to make the former janitor's position at the company feel completely untenable within a matter of months. One director in particular, a man named Richard Hale, who had spent over a decade climbing steadily toward more power and influence, began quietly building a case designed to push Ethan out before he could learn enough to become genuinely dangerous to their arrangement. Neither Richard nor anyone else on that floor could have predicted what Ethan would soon stumble upon, buried deep inside a project worth $50 million that was not at all what it appeared to be on paper. Richard had already spoken twice with a colleague on the board about drafting language for a performance review that would look reasonable on paper while quietly ending Ethan's role within the quarter. He believed, with the confidence of a man who had never once been questioned in that building, that a former janitor would eventually make a mistake large enough to justify his own instincts. What he did not account for was the very quality that made Ethan dangerous to men like him. A stubborn refusal to look away from something simply because looking away would have been easier and far more convenient for everyone involved. The numbers first caught Ethan's attention almost entirely by accident. Late one evening, a discrepancy so small that anyone without his patience might have simply scrolled right past it without a second glance. As he cross-referenced invoices with delivery records for a $50 million infrastructure project, working alone at his desk, long after most of the floor had emptied out, he found gaps that no legitimate accounting error should ever have produced. The deeper he looked into the paperwork over the following days, the clearer the pattern became, revealing what appeared to be a carefully disguised scheme designed to siphon company funds through deliberately inflated vendor contracts. Before he could bring his findings to Victoria directly, one of the executives involved approached him privately in a quiet corner of the parking garage, speaking in the calm, reasonable tone of a man long accustomed to making inconvenient problems simply disappear. He suggested that Ethan simply forget what he had noticed, framing the entire discrepancy as nothing more than a minor accounting oversight not worth anyone's valuable time or attention this late in the fiscal year. Then he named a figure, $500,000, more money than Ethan had ever imagined holding in his entire life, enough to erase every remaining hardship Lily might ever face growing up without her mother. For a long, heavy moment, Ethan said absolutely nothing, staring at the man seated across from him in the dim light, feeling the full weight of a decision that would define exactly what kind of father he truly intended to be for the rest of his life. He thought of Lily asking him once why he always told the truth even when it clearly cost him something valuable, and the way he had answered her without a single second of hesitation back then. He walked straight to Victoria's office that same evening and laid out everything he had discovered, refusing the offered money without so much as a flicker of doubt in his steady voice. What followed was a swift and thorough internal investigation, one that eventually exposed a far larger pattern of fraud stretching quietly across multiple departments of the company over several years. Auditors brought in from outside the company later confirmed that the scheme had already cost Sinclair Group nearly $9 million before Ethan's careful eye had ever caught the first thread, a fact that silenced even his loudest critics on the board for a good while. As the truth unraveled layer by layer over the following weeks, Victoria found herself confronting an uncomfortable realization about her own leadership style. That brilliance alone had never truly been the quality she most needed surrounding her at the top. What she had genuinely been missing all along, she understood now with painful clarity, was simple, uncompromising honesty. The very thing Ethan had offered without ever once being asked for it in return. She thought back to a dozen decisions she had made over the years, relying solely on reports handed to her by people whose loyalty had turned out to be far thinner than their credentials suggested. She wondered, not without some discomfort, how many other problems had been quietly buried beneath confident presentations and carefully worded summaries designed to please her rather than inform her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria began scheduling regular conversations with employees several levels below her own office, insisting that Ethan sit in on every single one of them. Those conversations, awkward and hesitant at first, gradually became something employees looked forward to rather than dreaded. A rare hour each week where rank seemed to matter less than honesty, and where a question answered truthfully was never once punished. When members of the board discovered that the person responsible for uncovering the fraud was the very same janitor recently promoted to special assistant, their fury reached an entirely new and dangerous level of intensity. They demanded, in no uncertain terms, that Victoria terminate Ethan's position immediately, arguing that his continued presence created unnecessary risk and public embarrassment for the entire company and its shareholders. Victoria refused outright, standing firm in a boardroom where very few people had ever seen her raise her voice with such quiet, unshakable conviction before that particular day. What happened next surprised absolutely everyone in the building, including Victoria herself, as word of the tense confrontation quietly spread through every floor of the company within hours. Employees from departments Ethan had never even personally visited began circulating a petition on their own initiative, gathering thousands of signatures within days to show their unwavering support for the man who had once mopped their floors. One by one, people came forward, sharing stories that had never once reached leadership's ears before. Quiet moments where Ethan had helped a struggling coworker carry boxes, covered someone's difficult shift without asking for any recognition, or simply listened patiently when no one else had time to. Not a single person could recall him ever complaining about his own circumstances, despite everyone eventually learning just how difficult those circumstances had truly been for years on end. A woman from the accounting department, someone Ethan had barely spoken more than a few words to in passing, wrote that he had once quietly covered her parking fee for an entire month after noticing she always arrived on foot, never once mentioning it to anyone, or expecting to be thanked. Reading through page after page of heartfelt testimonials late into the night, Victoria realized something profound was happening beneath the surface of her own company, something far larger than one man's employment status alone could ever explain. The culture of Sinclair Group, so long defined by polished appearances and quiet, unspoken fear, had begun shifting into something warmer and more honest without anyone officially announcing the change out loud to the press. Victoria understood, staring at those thousands of signatures spread across her desk, that she was standing at the edge of the most significant decision of her entire professional life so far. It would require her to choose, publicly and permanently, between the comfortable expectations of the boardroom and the quiet integrity she had witnessed firsthand with her own eyes in that hallway months earlier. She spent the rest of that night preparing, not for a fight with the board, but for a conversation she had been quietly avoiding with herself for far longer than she cared to admit to anyone, including her closest friends. She thought about her father again that night, and about the small hardware store he had run for 30 years before his heart finally gave out on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. He had never built an empire, never chased a headline, yet every person who walked through his funeral line seemed to carry a story about some quiet kindness he had shown them without ever expecting anything back. She remembered standing beside the casket as a stranger, an old customer she had never met, told her that her father had once given him a furnace on credit during a brutal winter, never once mentioning the debt again in the years that followed. Victoria realized, sitting alone in her apartment with the city lights spread out below her window, that she wanted her own name to eventually mean something closer to that, rather than simply a number on a stock exchange ticker. A few weeks later, once the dust from the investigation had finally settled, Victoria invited Ethan and Lily to dinner at her home, an invitation that felt far more personal than professional from the very first moment they arrived at her door. Lily, recovering well and full of the fearless honesty only children seem to possess without effort or hesitation, looked up at Victoria partway through the meal and told her she reminded her of her mother. The room fell completely silent for a moment, Ethan unsure what to say. Victoria momentarily caught off guard by how deeply those few simple words managed to affect a woman who rarely let anything move her. She had spent years building walls so tall that almost no one ever attempted to climb them. Yet here was a 7-year-old dismantling those same walls without even trying to on purpose. Over the following weeks, Ethan slowly began opening up in ways he had not allowed himself to in years, sharing quiet memories of his late wife Sarah, his fears as a single father raising a daughter alone, and his hopes for Lily's future once she was fully healed. Victoria, in turn, confessed something she had never once said aloud to anyone in her professional circle: that she had never truly believed marriage or family was meant for someone built the way she was, all ambition and armor. That belief, she admitted quietly one evening over dinner, had started to change from the very moment she met the two of them together in that hospital hallway. They began spending time together outside the walls of the company, volunteering at community events on weekends, visiting children's hospitals together, and slowly building something neither of them had expected to find inside a corporate boardroom of all places. What had begun as simple gratitude slowly transformed into something neither of them could easily name, something patient and unhurried, and entirely unlike anything either of them had experienced before in their separate lives. Lily noticed it long before either adult admitted it to themselves out loud, teasing her father gently about the way his voice changed whenever Victoria's name came up in casual conversation at breakfast. One evening, she quietly asked Victoria, without any warning, whether she would ever consider becoming part of their small family for good, a question so direct that it left Victoria speechless for a long moment before she managed to answer honestly that nothing would make her happier. As the months passed steadily by, marked by small dinners and quiet weekends, and growing trust between all three of them, Victoria found herself preparing for something far more significant than another quarterly earnings call. She began drafting a speech she intended to deliver to the entire company, one that would reveal exactly how much her perspective had transformed since the night she first saw a stranger crying quietly in a hallway that had once felt so ordinary. She rewrote the opening lines more times than she could count, discarding drafts that sounded too polished, too rehearsed, too much like the version of herself the board had always expected to hear from that podium. Ethan offered to help her practice one evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, while Lily colored quietly nearby, and told her the truth rarely needed decoration to land the way it was meant to. When Victoria finally settled on the words she wanted to say, she felt something she had not felt before a major announcement in years, not anxiety, but a strange and steady calm. Standing before the full company for the first time in her long career, gathered in the largest conference hall the headquarters had to offer, Victoria announced a series of changes that no one in that room had ever expected to hear from Sinclair Group. She unveiled a new medical assistance fund designed specifically to help employees cover the cost of critical care for their children, ensuring no other parent would ever face the same impossible choice Ethan once had to face alone. Alongside it came a scholarship program for the children of employees, along with an emergency relief fund built to catch families before they fell too far to recover on their own without help. She introduced expanded family leave policies as well, explaining plainly to the room that a company's true strength was ultimately measured by how it treated its most vulnerable members, not merely by its quarterly profits on a spreadsheet. Ethan, meanwhile, was formally named Director of Corporate Culture, a title that raised eyebrows across the entire industry but made perfect sense to everyone who had actually worked closely beside him over the past year. He had earned it, Victoria told the room with quiet conviction, not through a diploma hanging on some wall, but through the kind of character that could not be taught in any classroom or business school in the country. The applause that followed lasted far longer than protocol usually allowed, and Ethan, standing at the edge of the stage in a suit that finally fit him properly, found himself thinking of the nights he had mopped that very floor, believing no one would ever notice him at all. A year passed after that announcement, filled with small transformations inside the company that mattered just as much as the large ones: employees speaking more honestly in meetings, leadership listening more closely to complaints, fear slowly giving way to genuine trust between people at every level. The medical fund alone had already covered treatment for 11 children across the company by the end of that first year, families who would never know that a janitor's private heartbreak had quietly become the reason help arrived in time for their own children. Richard Hale, the very director who had once tried to buy Ethan's silence, eventually resigned from the company altogether, unable to find comfortable footing in a culture that no longer rewarded quiet manipulation over honest work. He left quietly, without ceremony, and few people on the executive floor ever spoke his name again after the boxes were carried out of his office for the last time. On a quiet evening overlooking the city skyline, the same skyline she had once stared at alone through her office window, Victoria knelt down in front of Ethan and asked him to marry her, tears in her eyes as she spoke, words she had never once imagined saying to anyone in her entire life. Lily, watching nearby with her hands pressed over her mouth in surprise, laughed and cried at the same time, throwing her arms around both of them before either had even finished speaking their vows to one another. The wedding that followed was simple by deliberate design, filled with close friends, honest laughter, and none of the extravagance people might have expected from a woman of Victoria's considerable wealth and standing. Lily served as the flower girl, taking her role with the seriousness of a child who understood that this particular day mattered more than any other, scattering petals along a path lined with the same employees who had once signed a petition on Ethan's behalf. Several of Victoria's board members attended as well, men and women who had once demanded Ethan's dismissal, now standing quietly among the guests with an understanding that had grown slowly over many months of watching him prove them wrong, without ever once raising his voice to do it. It closed with a single image that would linger in the memory of everyone who witnessed it that day. The three of them walking hand in hand into the headquarters of Sinclair Group, past a newly mounted plaque near the entrance that read, "A company only truly succeeds when no one is left behind. Kindness, in the end, has a way of creating miracles far greater than money could ever create on its own, no matter how large the fortune behind it. The person holding the most value in any room is often the very one everyone else has trained themselves not to notice. Quietly working while the world looks elsewhere. A single opportunity, offered at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person, has the quiet power to rewrite the entire future of a family struggling in silence. True leadership is never only about building a company or a balance sheet, but about building the people who make that company worth building in the first place, one honest choice at a time. And love, the kind meant to last a lifetime, almost always begins quietly, rooted in respect, in gratitude, and in the smallest, most ordinary acts of genuine kindness that no one ever expects to be repaid.